Good evening. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be among you. Let me tell you what I think we should be talking about, and then I'll give you the kind of overarching context. I suppose the argument is this, that strategic communications as a recently emerged form of political influence and geopolitical influence is really an extension of liberal democratic thinking. It's the projection of liberal democracy at a particular time in the history of liberal democracy, and liberal democracy itself is now going through a period of whatever you'd like to call it, self-reflection, or is it actually fragmentation? Therefore, the question is, where is strategic communications headed in that case, if the two are so closely bound together? Given that very few people really understand strategic communications from a conceptual point of view, so I thought what I'd do is just give you a quick summary of what it is. And that thinking is very much anchored in theoretical and conceptual work that we've done, particularly inside NATO, on the civilian side of NATO, but also with reference to the military side of NATO in the last 10 years. And another way of putting it is really that we've been reverse engineering theory into a field which has been dominated by practice, and I would argue really since strategic communications was taken up by leading politicians and statesmen only about 15, 17 years ago. It sounded good at the time, but nobody really knew what it meant. But then everybody started using it, and governments wanted to hear more and more about what it is, but there was no theory or conceptual thinking to go with it. So we spent the last 10, 15 years effectively bringing in the heavy diggers, the tractors and the diggers, to actually create foundations for this field of distinctive political and geopolitical communications. So that's kind of where I'd like to go with this conversation, because I think we should make it a conversation shortly. But you may not be surprised, because I'm not the first person to quote this, but I'm just going to quote from an article I wrote not so long ago, where in turn I say that we risk overusing these days Gramsci's prison notebooks, but there's a good line in there that says, Gramsci writes, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And I would argue that is the period that we're living through at the moment, the interregnum, where the old is not yet ready to die and the young is struggling to be born. So let's talk about what is it. What is strategic communications? Okay. Strategic communications isn't simply communicating strategically, because anybody can communicate strategically, anybody and everybody communicates tactically. Newborn babies very quickly learn how to do both. Strategic communications, which really kind of started to catch fire around 2008, 2009 period, it really has a kind of shopping list. Key criteria that there's now a kind of consensus around what the checklist should have in it. So one, strategic communications is about, well, let's do the overarching bit. It is about shifting and shaping long-term discourses in societies to achieve positive change. And I have to put inverted commas around the word positive, because what does that mean? Because you could argue that no change can actually be positive. But that's the overarching thought. So the checklist, strategic communications, is about the long term. Strategic communications seeks to achieve strategic effects. So it's not just communicating generally. It's not just loosely firing off any forms of communications. It, next on the checklist, it targets specific audiences. It then sets out to measure the effect between where you started and the strategic effect where you finish. It occurs in a competitive, in a contested and dynamic media environment. There is no God-given right why anybody should expect to be heard or seen, never mind believed. The media environment is highly contested, it's dynamic, and a lot of the time, particularly if you're talking about governments, nobody knows that they're even communicating. Partly because they're so boring, partly because people don't really care that much about what government has to say, and partly because there are also people out there who are shouting louder than the government. So on the checklist, and here's a question mark on the checklist, it's an intergovernmental or interstate form of political or geopolitical communications. Some people would argue that's too exclusive a category, that it's for states to communicate with sub-state actors, supra-state actors, or trans-state actors as well. This is quite difficult because you get into difficult definitional territory. So, for example, it's much simpler to be able to say it's between sovereign states, or at least between a sovereign state and the people, the population of another sovereign state. That's easy because at least it's bordered. But what happens if you introduce sub-state actors or trans-state actors? So an easy comparison is Al-Qaeda and ISIS, two very different kinds of organizations. One which is extremely horizontal, Al-Qaeda, the other which is very vertical, ISIS. Al-Qaeda, which clearly has had enormous effect on different audiences around the world in the last 20, 30 years, but does not seek to be a state. So would you say, therefore, that it performs strategic communications? ISIS, on the other hand, was a proto-state. It did seek to be a state according to any Weberian definition of a state. So does that mean that ISIS did strategic communications and Al-Qaeda didn't do it? Question mark. So these are things which are all still being discussed from a definitional point of view, from a conceptual point of view. We also say that it arises, essentially, those of you who are interested in kind of social constructivism and symbolic interactionism, that it comes out of kind of people like Mead and Bloomer. At least it's kind of the origins of the concept. So you're talking about strategic communications being fundamentally about telling stories. And it's telling stories about the past. So taking control of the past in order to claim a legitimate role in the present, in order to legitimize your role and own the future. So it's very Orwellian, you could argue. That's exactly what George Orwell said the state was all about, and what fundamentally state theory can relate to. And so we also say that if you can imagine a triangle that has at each point memory construction, which is basically looking back to the past and reinterpreting the past to suit your own political objectives, which is what a state does. At one point, say you've got memory construction. At another, you've got storytelling. And at another third point, you have identity creation. And the three work in tandem. So you construct memory, process it through storytelling, and the storytelling reinforces, continual storytelling, reinforces your own identity or your community's sense of identity, and indeed your society's identity, etc., etc. And we talk about strategic communications works through images, words, actions, and also non-actions, a failure to act. If you don't act in politics, it also communicates. So that gives you a kind of very quick thumbnail sketch of what I think it is. And that's kind of where we've got to. And most people, whether they're practitioners, work for media agencies, work for government policy, would agree with all that. But believe it or not, it took us nearly 10 years to get to that stage of having this agreed checklist that everybody could agree on, the military people and the civilian people like me. But then we decided, well, that wasn't really sufficient to differentiate this new arrival from other forms of political communication, or indeed any form of communication. If you kind of think about what is out there already, advertising, commercial marketing, bringing ideas to a commercial capitalist marketplace, branding, some vague notion of trying to capture the spirit of a product or a corporate entity, public relations, which I would define as damage limitation and image management, propaganda. I don't even want to go there because this is academically an enormous spectrum of different opinions of what propaganda is. One of the most misunderstood words, I think, in political science. What have I forgotten? What else is missing from there? Political communications, it's a generic term. Some people would try and narrow it down, attach it to party politics, which at least allows you to separate it out from government communications. And in the context of strategic communications, often you'll find that governments actually equate the two. They think government communications is the same as strategic communications. And certainly if you look at the UK understanding of what is government communications, they would say government communications is evidence-based truth-telling. Sounds good. On closer examination, it's fraught with problems. Do governments always tell the truth? Do they always use evidence? What is evidence anyway? And then there's geopolitical communications. Of course, the term geopolitics is 100 years old at best. It went in and out of favor. It's back in favor very much, and now it's dragging with it a kind of neologism, a new term of geoeconomics, to kind of give it that extra boost of energy and make it relevant to different understandings of what's going on in the world. So I think if that makes sense, that's kind of what it is. Except what happened 2 years ago, in the winter of 23, and I keep going back to NATO, partly because I work for NATO, but I keep going back to NATO because it's the one forum, and it's got 32 member states sitting inside NATO. It's the one forum that puts money and time and energy into trying to talk about, define, understand, standardize the terminology in this emergent field of strategic communications. So 2 years ago, we finally got an agreement between the military side and the civilian side. I work for the civilian side. Militaries always write doctrine, as you know. Civilians don't write doctrine. They write reports. So our report from the Terminology Working Group, report number 3, sounds very kind of like Andy Warhol, report number 3. On the military side, the new military doctrine in the winter, spring of 23 was AJP 10. It was called AJP 10. And these two documents actually marry. They come together in the one crucial bit, which is trying to say, well, what makes strategic communications that different from any other form of communication? Because all the checklist I've given you so far, this shopping list, if you're sitting in Moscow or you're sitting in Beijing, you would say, sounds good to me. That's what we do. We can tick all those. Everything applies to us. But strategic communications arises out of, you might argue, at least in the last 20 years, arises out of a response, a reaction against the activities of Russia and increasingly China. So how come, are we willing to let them into the private members club, if I can put it that way, of strategic communicators? And the answer is no. So what is the defining factor that keeps them out and us in to this little club? And the answer is that strategic communications, certainly as of 2 years ago, we all seem to be now in agreement, finally, that it is anchored in the promotion and the protection of the fundamental freedoms of the individual. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and the freedoms from. Freedom from oppression and freedom from hunger. And those freedoms resonate with the founding treaty of NATO, 1949, which talks about NATO is set up to protect the freedom of the West, but of its member states, but also to protect liberal democracy and the rights of individuals, the freedoms of individuals. And that 1949, the Washington Treaty, echoes the 1945 United Nations Human Rights Charter, Eleanor Roosevelt's charter. And she and it echo Franklin Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Nation speech, winter of 41, when he talks about the 4 freedoms. So there's a kind of genealogy there, a development of really strategic communications is anchored firmly in liberal thought, which is, let's assume that is not what Moscow thinks they're about, or Beijing, or North Korea, or Iran. And so there's a kind of way of differentiating it. So if I can kind of put that all to one side now, that's how we understand strategic communication. So it is not just communicating strategically, which is what people will tell you. It's not. Only because we kind of have argued this through for so many years, and now we seem to have some kind of settled agreement. Having said that, there are not that many people beyond you and me who think in these terms, or at least are aware of this way of differentiating it from other forms of political and geopolitical communications. So I'll give you a very quick history, because the obvious question is, well, why now? If you're telling us that there's something that has suddenly emerged, and it claims to be a new form of political communication, maybe new is a bit too strong, a different form of political communications, then why now? I mean, why not 100 years ago? And some might argue it was around 100 years ago. I mean, I have one of my PhD supervisees who is writing exactly that, which is, she is arguing that strategic communications, the Latvian independence movement in the 1880s, 90s, 1910s, through to the First World War, was about strategic communications. I have another PhD student who's writing on the Emperor Augustus, the Roman Emperor Augustus, arguing that the creation of the Roman Empire was an act of strategic communications. Good, they're entitled to their opinions. I think it's exciting that people have different views. So, in my own research, you know, when I've been trying to dig away and trying to find out, well, where did this term come from? Why is everybody talking about it all of a sudden? And I noticed it first in 1997 in a document, a report that is created for Kofi Annan when he replaced Boutros Ghali as Secretary General of the United Nations. And you'll recall that the United Nations didn't have a good 1990s. If you think back to Rwanda, Bosnia, Somalia, they didn't acquit themselves particularly well. And Boutros Ghali was replaced by Kofi Annan, and Kofi Annan immediately asked the question, why does everybody hate the United Nations? I mean, we have these great, noble values and morals, but we're so unpopular. So they did a lot of talking, a lot of thinking, and they came up with the idea that the problem was that the UN spoke from the top of the mountain and spoke down to people and issued missives. And what it had to do was start to get on the same level as people, speak in their own language. I don't mean Somali or Bosnian. I mean speak to people in a language that they understand. Respect them and don't talk down to them. But also engage them in a conversation that sophisticated political communications should not be about preaching, should not be about sending out policy statements or manifesto promises. It should be about engaging as many people as possible in a mutual conversation, a conversation based on mutual respect of each individual, and don't talk down to them, and don't moralize and don't patronize them. So this is what the 1997 report said. But because of 9/11 and what followed 9/11, which was invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the perception of failure, I don't want to have the argument particularly with the general in the room. I don't want to argue whether or not ISAF forces did actually fail, but there was a perception of failure in Afghanistan and Iraq. And by 2008, when Russian troops invade Georgia, former Soviet Republic of Georgia, but now independent, a feeling grows in political elites that surely if the use of force has not succeeded, then maybe we have to revert in some way to the use of persuasion. And maybe there is a better way of persuading people that your case is more moral, is more desirable, and could be more effective, but ultimately can bring a better life to the people with whom you're speaking. So this is the background, but you can see it's kind of driven out of a security agenda, whether the spark for it was Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, or whether it was 9/11, Al-Qaeda, Manhattan, or whether it was setbacks, difficulties in Afghanistan, Iraq, and subsequently also Libya. And you could argue a bit later, Syria, during the Obama administration, and then Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. They all have a common theme, which is security. And then, of course, once we get to the invasion of Crimea in 2014 by Russian forces, then we're clearly on a security road here. But there were many of us who already back in 2010 were arguing that strategic communications, if it is to be a serious form of political communications, then it should not just be an addendum to the waging of war. It may feel like everything is about war, but actually it isn't. The majority of people on the planet are not engaged in actually waging war, and they have, for them, bigger concerns. They can be climate change, they can be pandemics like COVID, they can be mass migration, which is occurring at unprecedented levels, certainly in the last since 1945, particularly whether we're talking about economic aspirants or whether we're talking about war displaced. But there's an awful lot of people moving around the world, and this is affecting people who are citizens of nation states in what many of them would perceive as in adverse ways. It's giving them cause for concern, to put it mildly. So there's a kind of development which comes out of the security side, out of the security agendas. But some of those are pushing for strategic communications actually to have a much wider remit. The world is more than waging war. And there are big, big problems that humanity faces. So that gives you just a kind of quick thumbnail sketch of, I think, the trajectory. The question is why? I mean, why now? Okay, yes, maybe some of it comes out of the kind of self-reflection on the part particularly of Western states and the leaders of Western states who feel we're just not getting our ideas across to the rest of the world. And when we do decide to push into other countries and use force, military force, we seem to be getting it wrong. And so, yes, maybe we have to rethink what persuasion is all about. And you'll have noticed it's only a thin book, but it sold very well for Joseph Nye, formerly now deceased, but formerly of Harvard. And Joseph Nye's very simple analogy of soft power, hard power, and when you combine them, you get smart power. And, you know, when I discuss strategic communications with Joe Nye, he used to say, well, all you're saying is that strategic communication is the same as smart power. It's a calibration of the use of persuasion and the use of force to different degrees. And yeah, maybe he's right. Although soft power, hard power were not terribly well theorized pieces of thought, but they certainly worked well in the policy communities. I mean, governments read and loved these concepts. So why now? I mean, why at the beginning of the 21st century? Well, I think there are different things that have occurred. They're pretty obvious. One is the return of great power politics. 2 is and attached to that is the rise of China. And so China in terms of hegemonic ambitions, be they political, geopolitical, or geoeconomic, same thing. Russian neo-imperialism, irredentism, reclaiming, as in Ukraine, but Ukraine is only one. We've seen already in Georgia, and we've already seen in Nagorno-Karabakh, although that was complicity, you would argue, complicity between Turkey, Russia, and Azerbaijan. The emergence of mass available, low-cost, consumer digital technologies, which in turn have a knock-on effect that create accelerated, if not instantaneous, interconnectivity between nearly 8 billion people. Okay, maybe they don't all have smartphones, but even if half of them have that, that's an awful lot of people who are suddenly connected. When I say suddenly, within 10 years or so. And I'm just here talking about smartphones and the internet. We haven't even begun to talk about artificial intelligence yet and what effect that's going to have in pulling everything together and pulling everything apart again. The effect, I think, of mass migration, which I think we underestimate the effects of it. And I think that has also feeds into the context of why now. But I think, if you like, those are kind of the obvious. That's the obvious list of why we're talking or looking for a new form of political communications in the last 20 years. I think there's a less obvious list, and it's more contentious, which I would argue it's about seismic shifts. So different contexts and different seismic shifts that are going on in the world. It feels like, and I know you're going to say that every generation says that there's never been a time like now. It feels like the world is changing by the minute around us. But one of the few benefits of being my age is that at least you've got some miles on the clock, you've got some years behind you, and you do see change. Of course, you could argue you see it through the wrong end of a telescope, but still you see change. And certainly in my lifetime, I think I've not seen a period like this, and I think we're living through major, if I can use the word advisedly, paradigm shifts. And I think what we see around us is, yes, what was in the Cold War bipolarity that after the Cold War turned into unipolarity, and now, of course, we're dealing with multipolarity in geopolitics. That's one thing. I think we're dealing with another shift, which is multi-alignment. And multi-alignment means in very broad brushstrokes, people shopping for their security with the United States, people shopping for their energy with Russia, and people shopping for their markets with China. Broadly speaking, as a broad brushstroke idea. So I think there's multipolarity, multi-alignment, multi-dimensionality. These are really ugly words, aren't they? But multi-dimensionality. And what I mean by that is, it's a military concept, but I think it does make sense. It is that we need to think about communications through different lenses: land, sea, air, cyber, space. And when you are communicating, you can use any of those vectors, those spaces, and you can calibrate them. You use them in different ways at different times and in different combinations. Kind of seems obvious, no? Remember that it's not just about words that you're sending or indeed images, it's about actions that you take. And the actions that you perform or don't perform in land, sea, air, cyber, or space. So let's call that multidimensionality. And then I think there's also a shift that we're living through, which is multi-ideological. I think we are living through a renewed clash of ideologies. They're not necessarily expressed in those terms, in the kind of simplistic terms that we had in the Cold War, but I think this is happening. And the place to look for that, I believe, is not in the United Nations. That's the kind of the easy, kind of almost too easy way of looking at it. I think it's by examining the growing attraction and potential influence initially as an economic platforms, but almost immediately as a political platform of something like BRICS. I think BRICS is very important and will become even more important. And I think as an ideological base as much as by as an economic platform. So I think there are these different seismic shifts happening, and they are coming up against each other. And they are mutually reinforcing each other, but also crashing into each other with effects that we're struggling to understand. And then something else, which we really don't understand. We're all speculating. It's complete guesswork, as far as I can see, which is the very rapid arrival and embrace, particularly by consumers, of artificial intelligence, which I think is it's already happening, is transforming the world of influence and communications. So this old linear way of doing things, where we had started to come to terms with the embrace of the internet and digital mobile telephony, where we became sensitive to looking at understanding communications as a non-linear way of communicating that replaced the old historic legacy of linear communications. Now I think we're into something which is we don't understand. Once we apply artificial intelligence to non-linearity, particularly because of the way AI is coded from large language models, learns from large language models, and the way that algorithms are actually trying to reduce choice. So what effect does that have on non-linearity? What are we into here? If you think of it through a lens of command and control. So here's the dilemma. If strategic communications is indeed, as many of us think it is, the projection of liberal democratic values through a distinct form of political and geopolitical communications, then what happens when liberal democracy encounters problems? What happens to its form of communication? So currently, you could argue that liberal democracy depends whether you want to look at it as the glass half full or the glass half empty. If the glass is half full, liberal democracy is going through a good period of self-reflection, self-examination, trying to re-energize itself, rebirth itself, give it a new lease of life. If you look at the glass half empty, you say that liberal democracy is in trouble. It's fragmenting. It has been co-opted by a moralizing, narrow political elite that is disconnected from the base, from the majority of society. You could argue that. And that therefore liberal democracies are fragmenting. So that's one way of thinking about it. But there are very clear divisions that have emerged in recent years, and they go back quite a long way. This is not just 2016 onwards, nor is it even, I'm talking about United States, first election of Donald Trump. It goes further back to the Tea Party 10 years before. It goes even further back, I think, to the 1980s, and also the beginning of the failure of the state project, the Keynesian state project, in the 1970s with the two big oil crises and stagflation that the West encountered. So I think it goes back quite a long way. It's quite difficult because we're talking about kind of often subterranean trends in development, but the old body of liberal democracy seems to be splitting between a central core of liberal democratic values that haven't changed but are in need of a fresh burst of energy. Libertarianism, in the United States, that takes the form of Make America Great Again. Among the poorer Americans who feel distanced from political elites, in Washington particularly. But at the same time, in the libertarian end of democracy, there's a kind of unholy alliance. It's a very strange alliance, which is anti-state. What the techno-oligarchs, Bezos, Musk, Gates, you name them, Thiel, all those kind of people, who are anti-state, believe that the state is too interventionist, too regulatory, and actually they echo kind of anarchist thinking in the late 1700s, early 1800s, which felt that the state was the fundamental problem in the human condition. It was the state that was the problem. The state was oppressive. And this feeling is very apparent in the poorer, ill-educated, particularly white Americans. But it's also in the case of the techno-oligarchs sitting in Silicon Valley, who also believe the state is getting in the way. And what, Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, they would be quite happy, it would appear, particularly if you read someone like Alex Karp, who founded and runs Palantir, which has great influence now in Washington, D.C. It's as if they would be quite happy to have a supra-state existence. The state is actually getting in the way of business. It's getting in the way of technological development. And there's an unholy alliance between the techno-libertarians and the impoverished grassroots libertarians. And that's on one end of liberal democracy breaking down, and on the other side of liberal democracy are the illiberal Democrats. And you'll find them in Europe, particularly in state form, say Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, even Poland, the V4 countries. that we'd think of as kind of illiberal democrats. And that's before we move outside the democratic family. So these are, you could argue, internal threats, destabilizing factors to liberal democracy, and the external would be authoritarians and totalitarians. We mentioned them before, Russia, North Korea, China, and so on. So in that sense, if liberal democracy is under threat, on the one hand, and if the very nature of what it means in the 21st century to communicate in a world that is about to embrace totally artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence which is owned by two bodies, one, the United States, but not as a state so much as a San Francisco oligarchy, and on the other, the Chinese Communist Party and companies in the Chinese marketplace. So where does that leave political and geopolitical communications that believe they are anchored in protecting the fundamental freedoms of the individual? So I'm giving you questions because we don't have answers. And we don't have answers because it is happening so fast before our eyes. And the people who really are the last to understand it, it strikes me, the effect of it, the real life effect of it, not the abstract notion, are governments. Governments still talk about, should we, as political elites, are we looking at something which is a new technology? Are we looking at something which, and we can use that effectively, but we can bar it, block it, its negative effects? Should we regulate it? What should we do? Should we slow it down? I think the answer is they're dreaming. The train has already left the station and they're still buying a ticket. AI is already down the track and governments cannot regulate and keep up with it. The only people who I think understand it are intuitively the marketplace. Consumers recognize what they want and they'll pay money for it, particularly if it's cheap. And it is very cheap. And the people who own it, the oligarchs. So maybe Varoufakis is right when he says that capitalism is dead, but capital is very much alive and kicking. But that we have moved from, historically, certainly if we think about European-driven and Western thinking, we moved from feudalism 500 or 600 years ago to capitalism, and now someone like Varoufakis would argue we have now moved from capitalism to techno-feudalism. We are signing away all our rights, all our individual freedoms to the techno-oligarchs. It's a view. It's not a fact. It's an opinion. But it's a worrying one if that's true, and it feels like there's an element of truth in that.
Thank you so much for that lecture. Very provocative and very deep thinking. Let's give a big hand to the speaker. Thank you so much, Noble, for your time.